right, welcome back everyone. So we have another fantastic plenary session coming up, which will focus on the socio-ecological tipping points in the nature-based sectors, such as food, agriculture, fisheries, and land use. And we're very much looking forward to the introductions and the panel discussion. This session will be chaired by Eva Gladek, who is the founder and CEO of Metabolic, and has worked with many organizations in nearly every economic sector, from NGOs to progressive cities to industry leaders, to jointly shape a more sustainable and circular future in our economy. So, Eva, please take it along. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So it's wonderful to be here with all of you. This has been a really deeply enjoyable event so far. And it's great to come back to a very academic environment after many years of being out of that. This is a much less academic panel in many ways, as you can see by the attendees. And I'm very excited about the discussion. So one of my remarks over the last days has been that obviously, for very good reasons, there's been a lot of focus on climate. But today in this session, we're also going to be focusing on nature. One of the best sources of intelligence and counter entropy that we have, a really critical buffer that we cannot afford to deplete. And I will just start by framing a few statistics about the way that we are interacting with natural systems before I introduce this amazing panel. So many of you may know that 96% of global mammalian biomass currently consists of humans and our livestock and pets. It's a pretty shocking number. We are absolutely dominant. And this is another statistic that you may have heard of. In 2020, for the first time in history, man-made products outweighed the total mass of all life on Earth. And actually, materials are one of the things that are driving all of these different impacts that we're experiencing across the board and driving us toward these tipping points. But as we start to try to decarbonize and work toward solutions, we need to be extremely careful that we don't damage nature and really push natural systems and biodiversity past their own tipping points. So I just have like a few quick slides from our own research that we did on actually the construction sector in Europe, which consumes around 1 million kilotons of material each year, which is enough to construct 100,000 Eiffel Towers. This is a Sankey diagram that shows the material flows going through that sector. Most of that is dominated by concrete, a very CO2 intensive material. This used to be bio-based, not anymore. We actually looked at the carbon budgets for that sector, so took the worldwide budget, translated that to an EU plus UK budget, and then down to construction, and concluded that the carbon budget would run out in 2026. That is next year. So I think that this is, we basically can't really solve this particular problem. This is for 1.5. But, of course, we can't give up, we need to think of solutions. One of the solution pathways is to think of, okay, let's move to bio-based materials. So we actually did a modeling exercise to look at replacing all residential construction with timber, and looked at four different scenarios, and the 100% scenario showed that you could get a 40% reduction in total emissions, the same as 240,000 rocket launches, and that actually the carbon sequestration would result in canceling out the carbon emissions of construction in total over 30 years. However, this would require a 10 times increase in engineered wood products in Europe, which is the equivalent of a harvest area the size of Finland. So these are the kinds of consequences that we need to be considering when we're looking at decarbonizing certain sectors and putting pressures on others. And one of the things that we're really going to try to do in this panel is consider all of the different systemic interactions. So as we identify solution pathways in one area, how do we create different kinds of solutions? So instead of all of the unused housing in rural areas, how do we actually create ways of using that instead of building new things? That requires actually different dynamics, different mentalities, different ways of organizing our societies, potentially. So we are looking to identify different systemic opportunities to create these transition pathways And with the panel, we've discussed really looking at cascades, also between the different areas of work that this illustrious group is going to share, between social, ecological, informational, and economic domains. So we're going to go in a bit of an order of scale. First, we're going to have Rune Bastrup, who is the managing director of Democracy X. This is a Copenhagen-based organization with a staff of 50 experts focusing on deliberative democracy. And he is a frequent keynote speaker as well as a lecturer at the University of Copenhagen and has published 3 books and co-authored several white papers on positive tipping points and democratic action. And Rune will tell us about food systems transformation. Then we will have, at a slightly larger scale, more value chain and landscape level, Talia Smith, the Chief Programs Officer for the Circular Bioeconomy Alliance, a UK-based charity seeking to accelerate a transition to a nature-first economy. Talia was previously the Director of Nature and Food Systems at Systemic, a global systems change company, and also served as Director of Knowledge Generation for FOLU, the Food and Land Use Coalition. She has co-authored several analyses on a range of topics, including scaling investments in nature-based solutions and regenerative agriculture, and has over a decade of experience as an international development consultant, designing infrastructure, land use, and natural resource management programs in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. Then we have Tanya Steele, who leads the UK office of WWF, the world's largest independent conservation organization. She joined WWF in 2017 as its first female chief executive. And previously, following nearly 15 years in the private sector, she was the executive director of marketing, fundraising, communications, and the interim director of Save the Children. She heads up WWF at a critical time, leading an ambitious strategy to tackle the systemic issues from climate change to finance to the food system. Actually, I should have changed this so that you can all see them, sorry. And last but not least, we have George Monbiot, who is an author, Guardian columnist, and environmental activist who has best-selling books out there. Many of you have probably read some of them. They include Feral, Heat, and Regenesis, Feeding the World Without Devouring the Planet, which explores pioneering ways to grow more food with less farming. He was awarded the Orwell Prize for Journalism in 2022, and his latest book, The Invisible Doctrine, co-authored with Peter Hutchinson, recently topped the Sunday Times nonfiction best-selling list. It explores the shadowy history of neoliberalism and is accompanied by a film of the same name, which will be released this year. So really an amazing panel. They're going to speak in this order. Each of them will have 10 minutes, and it goes from really small-scale community to hopefully large-scale perspectives on neoliberal systems. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Rune.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Such a pleasure to be here, such a great conference. Thank you for the hosts and all that, and I hope I'll get through this without being too nervous, because it's quite an intimidating room to speak in front of. I want to start with something that gives my heart a bump, but also warms my heart because it's with my kids. So I'm speaking in front of you as a father of 4. My oldest son is 19 and the youngest one is 3. New York Times ran this headline on the front page the weekend he was born. And just to reflect a moment on those 2 decades of the difference, it's like worlds apart. And we should really remember, when we're struggling to find hope currently, that despite all the troubling setbacks, when people look at their kids, they feel compelled to support action to save our alien planet in different ways. So just about everyone has something in our lives that we care about that will be here in 2050, and that's important also to the stuff I'm going to talk about now. Our deep values is a starting point for our work, and for all kinds of interventions, including in our food systems. So I think that maybe that's a delay here. So we basically need to think of the moral resources also for when thinking of where we draw our energy, and really we need a lot of energy to be able to move the food system to the way we actually need. So basically the Earth System Science and the Positive Tipping Points framework is an excellent framework that we use a lot, but we really try and educate and emphasize the importance of also underscoring the cultural dimension of this, the cultural shift that we need in order to propel the kind of positive tipping points that we're hoping for. And we've been moving into the space of food consumption and really trying to convince actors at various levels that we should actually touch on the hot potato or the hot burger, hot hamburger, on how to actually engage people in dietary change at a national scale as well. So I'm going to use the demand side focus in this talk. And we've been, over the last 5 years, thanks to funding from KEA Foundation, working with local governments, with national governments and local communities to implement a framework of positive tipping points language that allows citizens, activists, mayors, administrators, planners at state and local level, retailers, farmers and chefs to work together. And just last year, one of the major retailers, one of the managers from there said, well, the tipping points framework might actually be the exact missing link that we need to coordinate and start working to getting real about changing the Danish food system. Now, as many of you might have realized, this is not really happening. Sorry? So the Danish case is interesting because the maturity of capital allocation, public awareness, and also political momentum has been rising over the years. And as you can see on the slides, substantial political improvements also in terms of this latest green tripartite agreement is put in place that also includes a carbon tax of sorts, which is way too small, we still believe, but is in place to get us working. However, when we look at the data for the last 10 years, we've reached a upper barrier in terms of the transformation of actual eating habits. And a more comprehensive and systemic approach to transforming consumption patterns is needed, but the national politicians are not there yet. And the reason is pretty simple. So the mandate for changing our food habits is not strong enough. The cultural norms are not there. So politics is downstream from culture, we should remember. So whenever we really want to get ambitious about climate change efforts, we really need to also work on culture. And this is a quote from Steve Bannon, who is the Donald Trump advisor, and who probably did Norbert Elias a lot, the German sociologist that some of you might know, who did a civilizing process study of how changes in taste usually precedes changes in structural norms and class formation as well. So really understanding the importance of how cultural change is a barrier or an enabler for system change at a broader level. And in Denmark, we've been spoon-fed with pork and meat because we have a very big meat and dairy industry. And that has pretty much produced a meat-based food culture that is the most significant upper barrier to change that we are facing right now. So we dramatically also need to work on our taste buds, what we crave, what we cherish. And we are engaging with the new Nordic food kitchen movement. This was spawned by Claus Meyer and René Redzepi, who later formed Noma restaurant in Copenhagen, and are famous for that work, at least in Denmark and somewhere else. And basically hypothesizing what might it look like to go from this culinary work of fine dining and to produce or to create a national movement of influencing ordinary households' everyday food choices. So Denmark, when I grew up, was a food desert. And now we are known for many of the important restaurants as well. And that's seen. But that kind of work takes others than just really charismatic chefs. It also takes movement work. So we work intensively with Marshall Gans out of Harvard, who's a legendary democratic legend in the US and also a scholar at Harvard University now. And he explains social movements as the effort of purposeful access to a certain new public values, form new relationships rooted in those values, and mobilize the political, economic, and cultural power to translate these values into action. He was made famous in his assistant of the Obama campaign, where 2 million volunteers were trained in his methods. So it's really a tremendously important sociological framework for how to, in practice, scale social movement building from the bottom up, but also in the work with municipalities, as I'll come to in a moment. So the core of this approach is to identify, recruit, and develop local leaders and build community around them. So one leader that we recruited is Klaus Meyer, as a case in point, but it's very much also the local Afghan woman in the municipality I'll come to in a moment, who has a broad network that we can reach when we start working with her, and she's really eager to find people to work together with. So the 5 core leadership practices that he's developed over the years is actually just the bread and butter of the work that we do ordinary. And that kind of very basic relational commitment through community organizing work that you can produce totally transfers the dynamic of what we're talking about here. It's not about politicians going out pointing fingers at citizens, but citizens engaging and then mobilizing each other, not necessarily because they want to save the world. Some of them who shows up doesn't, but they really want to do cool or interesting or rich stuff together with their neighbors. So the Old Testament has a saying that Marshall often quotes, where Moses was told to, if he ever were to free his people, he would have to have 1 in 10 of his people trained as a leader, selected as a leader, and allow that leader to actually go out and build community and identify further leaders. So with that 1 in 10 principle, we translate that to say tipping points in Denmark and a profoundly more deep green transition would actually necessitate that we reach 1 in every 10 Danes and allow them to appreciate how they can actually start working together to change our society in a climate-friendly manner. So where to go with that kind of work is very much on the local scale. So we're working on building up green neighborhood groups, as you can see in the image, and then seeing those closely knit networks as the really important point of intervention. As Donna Lametros was talking about, the important, the strategic question is to where to find the right ways to intervene in systems, and especially when dealing with complex contagion, as is the case with planetary or with health, planetary health transitions. We really need to understand how to work around complex contagion. There's a very different aspects than the most simple contagion processes. And here the standard communication and advertisement strategies does not really do the job. So what Damon Centola, a sociologist working in this field, his studies show is that protecting the innovators and working to widen bridges between innovators and early adopters is the key. Through likely the place-based interventions is the far superior strategy. And that is, of course, demanding. It takes a level of design, but really, really key. The sociological literature is pretty clear. Those tiny publics, those network spaces where people live their everyday life is really key to understanding how we might start appreciating scaling behavioral change. So the schools, the churches, where we commute, where we dine, where we relax or shop. And if we want to get real about norms change, we really should be able to devise strategies that allows us to intervene on the human scale, you might say. And it's actually quite easy to start working with municipality planners or other planners in this, but through the positive tipping points framework, talking about the neighborhood effect, and people are getting it pretty much right away. So cities and local governments, we believe, are really an ideal intervention point since situated at the periphery and also with a proximity to the relational networks of people's everyday lives. And therefore, our straightforward ambition is to work with the kitchen staff, with the New Nordic Kitchen movement leaders, with small-scale farmers, and the local communities that we already work with to build a national movement around dietary change, and doing that in a local setting in Brøndby, where we just kicked off, and we're working closely together with Tim and Steve and GSI and Brøndby Municipality to form a new movement there, supported by the Novo Nordisk Foundation, and basically seeing the city council members, green neighborhood leaders, and people showing up, the civic leaders of 125 local constituencies, including from the migrant communities that are really, really key to a suburban area where they called us 3 years ago, says there's not really a conversation around climate change here around, but we want to see if we should have a climate plan that all other Danish municipalities has as well. We need to see where our people are. And it turned out 300 people showed up for the first meeting if you only invite people in the right way. So we hope that we, by combining food joy and the great work from the New Nordic Kitchen movement and put that into a popular context, and then developing a so-called the longest table challenge, starting in Brøndby, but hopefully expanding nationally to a national movement where the football clubs and all the different the actors in a local community start working together, but also then competing with other neighbors and with other municipalities. And Brøndby municipality is very famous and proud of having the highest flagpole in Denmark. So the mayor said, oh, anything that's the longest, we're in. So it's a kind of like, and that's really well-funded, well-founded in research by Damon Santola as well, building up the local communities of closely knit groups, and then making them compete with each other is a really key way forward. And thereby also showing that all of a sudden, within a year, the municipality, city council, it was a non-partisan decision to just skip red meat already. So showing that the cultural work, the local community work, it directly impacts the mandate for city councils to start working more, or as Steve Bannon would say, culture is upstream from politics. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Really looking forward to getting into this. And Talia, you're
good. Well done. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes, great. Oh, I'm just going to adjust this. Almost done. Lovely to be here with you all, and thank you so much, Wona, for a great presentation so far. Oh, thank you. As Eva mentioned, my name is Talia Smith, and I am the Chief Programs Officer of the Circular Bioeconomy Alliance. The CBA, as it's known, is a fairly new charity. It's a UK-based charity, as Eva said as well, established by His Majesty King Charles to really accelerate this transition towards what we call a nature-first economy. That is an economy that is powered by and powered by nature. I'm really delighted to be here. It's not my first time at this conference. And when I was on the train this morning, I was, in many ways, it felt like coming home, and it's a real testament to you, Tim, and to the community that you've built here, which I think is really, really powerful. Now, I know we're on day 3, and up until now, we've been really focusing on the negative, the current situation that we're in, and Eva, your remarks as well, just sort of highlighting the impact or the threat to nature that currently exists. So before I shift to focus on the positive and where the opportunities are, there are 2 kind of really important key messages I want to convey with regards to the situation that we're in. The first point is that the current nature and climate crisis is creating a perfect storm in our economic system. So this is our economic crisis as well. It's not just an ecological one. And we're really seeing this in a number of different ways. German scientists in a recent paper have estimated that food inflation will increase at a rate of 3.5% per year in the coming 10 years due to climate change. We're seeing global insured losses due to the combined effects of climate change and nature degradation, which have doubled compared to 5 years ago. And if you look in specific value chains, we're also seeing dire economic impacts. And if you look at, for example, the coffee and cocoa industries, prices are surging. Cocoa prices have been surging by upwards of 250%. And why is this happening? It's completely and utterly interlinked with our natural world. As many of you know, a lot of the world's cocoa, 70% of the world's cocoa, is produced in West Africa in 2 specific countries, Ivory Coast and Ghana. These systems are really based on monoculture production, heavily chemically dependent on chemical inputs. The result is that this has degraded landscapes and really at the expense of 2.5 million hectares of natural forest over the past decades that's been transformed. This has led to a situation where these landscapes are vulnerable to heavy rainfall, the spread of fungi, coupled with heat waves that have facilitated the spread of viruses. What that means is that cocoa production, or in other words, extraction, has just now collapsed. Adding on a layer of this is then looking across the value chain, and this is specific to the cocoa industry, but also really relevant to the whole of the food industry, which is that we have a value chain that has between 15 and 20 intermediaries from end to end. So there's no space for margins, there's no space to allow farmers to get their fair share and help to invest in the landscapes, the regeneration that's needed. So we really need to think holistically across landscapes and across value chains to transform our economies in order for nature and climate to also thrive. The second point I wanted to make at a sort of conceptual level is that, we're talking about specific sectors and industries, food, etc., but there's no nature-based sector that is, unique. All sectors of the economy are based on nature. So nature is everything. We need to ultimately transform our whole economic system. We need to, we need nature, our economy, all of it is a subset of the biosphere, and it's not the other way around. This is a key design system flaw that we need to rethink in order to really think about how do we accelerate positive tipping points. Now, taking a step back, this can feel quite overwhelming to me personally, as talking to the panel in advance. I'm one person. How am I going to tackle the entire economy? Even this room of the most amazing thinkers and leaders. How do we start to unpack this quite overwhelming challenge? So that's when I started to look into the literature several years ago, and with a lot of great leadership from Tim Lenton and many of you in this room, to start to think about, well, how can we start to trigger some of these positive tipping points, specifically in nature and in the food system, but in a way that helps us also try and deliver these bigger goals. And I think the good news is that there are already a lot of signs out there, especially at landscape and at value chain level. I think there are already a lot of the knowledge and the tools, and many of you are, again, leaders in this space. But for me, I think it's important to focus on where those systems connect, and that's, again, in landscapes and in value chains. So let's take the example of coffee production. As I mentioned before, when talking about cocoa, conventional monocultures are highly extractive and climate vulnerable. But in contrast, agroforestry-based coffee systems can act as regenerative engines. They sequester carbon, they build resilience, they support biodiversity. They also increase productivity and generate a range of ecosystem services like pollination and pest control. Studies are showing these can be worth thousands of US dollars per hectare. But what separates this example from just being a good practice, good production system generating good outcomes towards a positive tipping point, is when we think about the feedback loops that are structured around this example. So when local communities see those improved yields and those improved incomes, then more farmers are incentivized to switch and adopt new practice systems and generate new revenue streams. As agroforestry spreads, landscape resilience also increases faster than they would in isolation, reinforcing adaptation. Buyers across value chains who commit to sourcing climate positive and nature positive coffee start to shift norms and procurement standards, which can influence global markets. When consumers see the comparability of regeneratively produced products in terms of taste, experience, and crucially affordability, more consumers can change their behavior. And when investors start to recognize these systems as low risk, high value investments, that's when capital can start to flow in the right places. So this is where the tipping starts to happen in the form of change that activates and reinforces others across social, ecological, informational, and economic dimensions. We see a similar story in terms of regenerative cotton, and this is one area in particular that the CBA is working on. Again, what matters isn't so much just the particular shift from one production system to another, but it's how the system around that is also evolving. So in this particular instance, we are supporting capacity of farmers to transition from conventional monoculture-based cotton production towards agroforestry-based cotton, reintroducing cotton to produce, this example is actually in Italy, where cotton used to be produced often in the Renaissance period, but has since been lost due to the changing ecological conditions, so it's now being reintroduced. And what we can see is that these interventions not only build the technical capacity that can support adoption, but we're also working together with corporate partners in order to demonstrate to those fashion brands that making long-term sourcing commitments can help also absorb the transition risk for their farmers as well as for their business risk. So I hope these examples have underscored why we need to focus on landscape and value chains, because this is where feedbacks concentrate. Landscapes are living systems. They're ecological and social systems. Value chains are also the arteries that move the resources, power, and information across these spaces. Landscapes are complex mosaics of land use, ownership, power, biodiversity, and economic activity, which makes them fertile ground for both the entrenched problems, but also the solutions. So for us at the CBA, we use landscapes and value chains as the organizing principles for how we want to trigger positive tipping points. We use 7 principles of regenerative landscapes that really embed this idea of being integrally based within a landscape, from the social as well as the ecological principles behind them, as well as thinking about the economic implications across value chains from end to end. And in addition to the work that we're doing at the CBA, I mean, there are countless examples of these bright spots. You know, we've seen these in Kenya, some of the work I know you people in this room are leading. We're seeing where regenerative production, tea value chains is starting to percolate because of peer learning and community organizing. We see also numerous examples in Brazil as well, where indigenous leadership is also driving shifts in finance as well. And we see this from the Pacific Northwest of salmon fisheries, as well as across Latin America. All of these examples, though, have a common theme, which is that when we sequence interventions, starting with real action, demonstration, we can then unlock the shifts in incentives, behaviors, and capital in order to tip systems. So a couple of years ago, as I mentioned, when I was diving into the literature and working with some of you in this room, we started thinking about, well, what are the conditions that we need in order for positive tipping points in food and land use systems to come about? And I think at that time, what I read a lot about was, trying to conceptualize what's the framework for positive tipping? How do we think about different policy interventions, economic interventions, technological interventions, behavioral nudges, and how do we see them lead to conditions? But over the last, since 2019, when this piece of work that at the time, when I was at the Food and Land Use Coalition, we published, since then there's been a real evolution in the literature, which is now focusing on really operationalizing and moving to action of how do we then take the framework and move into action. And this is a little bit of a sneak peek. I hope it's okay. I didn't ask him in advance, a paper that he and others have led, which is really starting to think about how do we action positive tipping points, or trigger actions to accelerate positive tipping points across different spatial scales. I'm not going to go into this in more detail because this is a shameless plug to come to the action workshop after this session, where we're going to go into this in more detail and we're going to put you to work and starting to map out what do we really need to do to make change real. But I think, what this is really starting to show is that as a community, we're starting to move from concept into action. And I don't know about you, but I'm very ready for it. Before I go there. So I will take a step back, though, and I have to say it's not all so positive. We're not seeing the positive tipping points get to scale yet. So there's lots of landscape initiatives, as I mentioned, but we don't yet see the value chain alignment. Farmers are improving soils and doing all the right things, but without the buyers and all the value chain actors, then we're seeing there are major gaps to us accelerating that. Without products at scale, like regenerative wool or climate smart rice, then we'll always have capital flows and procurement contracts that favor conventional models. So regenerative products are still niche. They're not yet for mass consumption. And behavior changes in consumers and citizens are starting to percolate, but they're not yet translated into wide-scale standards or investment rules. So that's why we really need to emphasize this idea of sequencing across scales and not just individual actions, but thinking about how they lead to those impacts. And ultimately, that's why the CBA was created, and I would be remiss if I also didn't acknowledge Tanya, who will speak next, as one of our trustee members, and many of you who we would invite to work with us. What we want to do is to help build on existing knowledge, scientific, indigenous, and others, and forge transformative partnerships to demonstrate exactly how we can apply and move to that action that I mentioned, so not just from theory, but really to action. We were set up, as I mentioned, in 2023, and what we were trying to do is implement a series of living labs, and those are those demonstration projects I talk about, which can help drive those positive tipping points that I spoke about. In addition, we've also established a fellowship on reimagining nature finance and inclusive capitalism, which I think is important because it's not only about projects on the ground, we also need to really critically evaluate and start building a community around how finance flows ultimately impacting nature. So in closing, I wanted to just leave 2 words of an invitation really to deepen this work together. One is, let's be candid about where the friction exists in the system. There are barriers to change. The positive signs are there, but there are still barriers in order for us to forge alignment across scales, across actors, and across levers. But let's work together to focus on the leverage points across value chains and landscapes, and not just these individual examples. For that, we need coalitions of actors, academia, governments, businesses, and communities. This isn't about sort of magic solutions, but this is about us taking courageous decisions together, sustained collaboration, and the willingness to work across silos. So let's do it. Thank you very much.
Great.
Really well done. It's brilliant. It's really lovely to be here. Thank you so much, Tim and colleagues, for inviting us to join to this conference. I was chatting with someone in the washroom earlier. Sounds sinister. I promise you it wasn't. And she turned to me and she said, "Is your head full up right now?" And I said, "Yeah, it really is." But this is a head and heart conference. There's some incredible scientific minds in this room. But I think we're all feeling the emotion and the need for what it is we think we need to do next. And I guess what I'd like to do is just scaling up again a little bit, is really start to hone in and think about what I'm going to call very broadly, it's not a perfect definition, but what might be some of the political positive tipping points that we might need to accomplish together in this room and indeed in and around the world as well. And of course, with COP30 coming up in the autumn in Belém, I'd particularly like to focus on how we might try and keep some of the world's great, not some, all of the great world's forests standing. And 2 years ago, I was in the, actually literally 2 years ago, in the Tapajós region in Brazil. I've been privileged to travel to Brazil many times, and the Amazon never fails to leave me pretty open-mouthed. And of course, I can see the delightful Carlos here on the front row as well, whose science we all follow closely. And the reason for being there was this was 6 months into a new Lula administration, and this was a time for hope, but it was also some time for some strategic planning as well. And against the backdrop of the mighty Amazon rainforest, the size of India, and ultimately the home of, I think, 10% of the world's known species, I can't think of a better place to start to consider what that strategic planning might be. But this wasn't a tourist trip staring at the beauty of some of the major tributaries coming from the Amazon, or indeed the flora and fauna that exists there. This was also an opportunity to spend time with many of the communities on the front line. And travelling with Chai, she's a member of the WWF Brazil board. She's a very famous climate activist. She actually comes from an incredible activist family, certainly her mother in terms of a series of social issues, and indeed her father, Chief Sarai too. But sitting down and meeting communities, and indeed hearing Chai's story, is a sharp reminder. And we heard a lot of this in the excellent plenary session yesterday. We're facing some very distinct social systems that are changing and are being threatened right now by the very significant earth shifts and system changes too. But these are communities living on, quite literally, the front line of forest loss, the growing number of fires, and their ability to not just monitor, but actually the resources they have in place to even attempt to deal with some of those fires. It's also a setting, of course, of increasing levels of violence and illegality, driven by a whole combination of land grabbing, but indeed very organised crime as well. But this is also an area where these communities, and indeed the wildlife they live within, that are facing some of the most desperate elements of food and water security. And certainly as a wildlife organisation, seeing an endangered species like the river dolphin in 2023, we lost at least 330 individuals. That was due to the scale of the water temperature rise because of the heat and indeed the impacts that we're seeing in and across the Amazon rainforest. So this is a backdrop of challenge and difficulty, as well as we know moments of hope and indeed some very powerful governance from these communities. But the Tapajós region and indeed the shores of the Tapajós are also home to really extensive levels of soy processing and indeed transportation across the world. This is just a glimpse of one of those massive processing centres. This is the Cargill Centre on the shores of the Tapajós. And this isn't just a Cargill issue, there's a whole range indeed of a massive production system that sits in Brazil and indeed other forest systems in and around the world with different, very, very different soft commodities. And I've got to say, it's impossible not to be impressed by the sheer scale that sits in and around this industry. The scale of barges coming through the tributary systems, and from the Europeans, this is like a sea when you stand in a tributary, let alone when you actually get onto the main Amazon River itself. The ports are complex, they're huge, and this is an incredibly complex, busy, determined setting where soy is being transported from the very inner regions of Brazil across the Cerrado, the very large savanna, on road and indeed by sea, to then go out on the larger tankers that are ocean going to effectively arrive at our own shores in Europe and indeed shores in China to supply soy that largely feeds chickens, pigs and cattle. So there's no doubt that our demand and our consumption is unquestionably driving not just the demand that is legal, but certainly the illegal demand as well. And importantly, it's naive, not to mention the economics of the soy for Brazil. Why wouldn't a forest nation want to exploit its natural resources? You know, there are exports worth over $53 billion for Brazil in 2023 on soy alone, around 3/4 to China and double the value of the US export market. This is important for jobs, it's important for the economy, and it's important for livelihoods as well. So the basics of supply and demand unquestionably put pressure and increase the likelihood of illegal deforestation. But so do a whole range of other factors as well. The very limited resources available to local communities to actually tackle the forest loss locally, not least in terms of the lands that ancestrally they own and steward. The impact of the changing climate, compounding forest loss that we're already seeing in parts of the Amazon that are starting to become closer to a carbon source than a sink. The flows of finance that absolutely underpin the huge-scale commodity trade, usually from cities on faraway continents. And I guess, not least, the non-existent or the very poorly implemented laws that really should be stopping illegal deforestation making it onto our supermarket shelves on a daily basis. So I guess where is the positive tipping point within all of this for our forests? The moment at which we can say their loss has disappeared and actually we might start to see some form of recovery. In the mix, there are some commitments. Certainly at the COP26 conference nearly 4 years ago, we saw 140 global leaders stand on stage and make a commitment to end illegal deforestation by the end of this decade. There's a whole range also of existing funding commitments to safeguard our forests, and actually some very exciting ones in the pipeline too, not least the Tropical Forest Forever facility being stewarded by the Brazilian government ahead of COP. There's disclosure that we're seeing through a whole range of mechanisms, whether it's the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures and more besides, that actually starts to encourage or indeed ask business and financial institutions to actually crack open their books and understand where those steps of illegality and indeed risk lie. And of course, there's a whole range of potential laws nearly over the line, whether it's the EU deforestation regulation, whether it's here in the UK, our own due diligence. And whilst many of the commitments and mechanisms are there, many are not, or indeed are far from being fully operational. And with 6.7 million hectares of primary forest lost around the world last year, there's an awful lot that isn't going well for us. It's not that we don't understand the causes of deforestation. The biggest driver is clearance to make way for agriculture, for domestic and indeed regional consumption. And it's not that individually the solutions don't exist. We know that we could provide more finance for communities on the front line. We could certainly invest and provide a greater value in keeping forests standing than forests cut down. We could invest in the transition, the farmers who actually really would like to move to much more sustainable standards. We could look to reform the global finance system to disincentivise investments that drive the loss of nature. We could also work, not least with some of the reforming key commodity import markets. If we think about China and the role of COFCO, how can we actually ensure that they might start to shape not just their own demand, but indeed the sheer scale of the commodities they input from around the world, start to set the tone for trade moving forward. We could, as I mentioned a few moments ago, legislate to actually get deforested commodities out of our supply chains. We could and we should do all of these things. But to reach that tipping point, we also need to do a number of things that we need to stop. Let's not use public money. That's taxpayers' money, yours and mine, that actually goes to help keep forests standing, whilst our governments also are carrying out actions or enabling actions to take place that are ultimately driving their destruction. We need to rebalance the ledger. The $2.2 billion a year of public forest positive finance is less than 1% of the arguably precious finance that is, again, putting pressure on the ability of forests to stay standing. Let's not see world leaders pursue trade deals that undermine the protection of the same landscapes that they've vowed to protect. And let's not dither and delay with legislation, or at least get it nearly over the line, and then actually start to introduce simplification measures that will effectively reduce their effectiveness. We currently live in the worst of both worlds. Governments and businesses are acting to both protect forests, but also destroy them. So what one hand may give, the other may indeed take away. And the latter is winning out. So the positive tipping point solution is to understand this and to recognise the complexity and the interconnectedness of actions that matter. There is no single silver bullet here. We know what the levers of change are, but we need to pull them all at once. And we know the impacts of forest loss is unquestionably being felt locally. And without impact, we've certainly heard at this conference that they will affect us all in enormous and in quite terrifying ways. But ultimately, I think communication is also our additional challenge here as well. And I know George, in a minute, will be speaking to us as one of, frankly, the greatest communicators of this agenda in our time. I know, George, you'll say otherwise, but I think the audience would agree with me. We warn about the dangers of a world warmed beyond 1.5 degrees. We advocate for the need to protect 30% of our forests, our land, our rivers, and our seas. And we're right to do so. These numbers matter. They are the scientific basis for the actions that we call on governments and businesses to undertake. But they do confront us with a degree of abstraction. Notwithstanding the current heat wave that I think we've all enjoyed, the full force of events feels far too far away. And we need to move to communicate in a way, and to relate is going to be the critical challenge if we are really going to deliver on this positive tipping point in the future as well. As scientists, you've given us the tools, and I'd like to thank you for that and to acknowledge the incredible work you've done in helping us to make the case of the crisis and the action that we need to undertake. But for the communicators, the campaigners, the activists, the backroom advocates in this room, we now need to make the case with greater clarity and urgency to achieve that tipping point, that positive tipping point for the future, and to demand irreversible action. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tanya. Well, after that, I could only fail. For the past 10 years or so, there's been a series of papers in the scientific press warning that the global food system is looking very much like the global financial system in the approach to 2008. It is losing key elements of systemic resilience. It's losing its redundancy as all the players within it increase the efficiency of their operations. There's less and less spare capacity. It loses diversity as we head towards the global standard diet, supplied by the global standard farm. It's losing asynchronicity as the systems right across the world synchronize with their just-in-time delivery, with their perfectly replicated container ports and container ships and container trucks all around the world, everyone doing the same thing. It's losing modularity, the compartmentalization of the system as global corporations integrate their operations. It's losing its circuit breakers, the regulations, the restraints which might stop monopolies from forming, which might prevent environmental crisis from taking place. Those are stripped away as a result of corporate lobbying. And it's losing its backup systems, different ways of achieving the same end, different ways of supplying us with food as everybody is driving towards those similar ends. These are very, very dangerous moves which are taking place, but it's almost entirely under the public radar. Scarcely any of those scientific papers have been picked up either in the press or in any parliament or congress around the world. It's as if that conversation is not happening. And for the scientists involved, it must be like being behind a sheet of plate glass, where they can see your lips moving and your hands banging on the glass, but no one can hear what you're saying. It's an immensely dangerous situation. And while at the 11th hour, with the global financial crisis, the world's governments were able to prevent collapse with enormous public expenditure through the issuance of future money in the form of quantitative easing, if we're heading towards collapse with the food system, we won't be able to prevent it by issuing future food. A financial system collapse would have been extremely dangerous. Food system collapse is almost unimaginably so. Now, there are several potential factors which could help tip this over the edge, but it might be none of these. It could be something so small that we're not even thinking about it at all. It could be, for instance, the interruption of a couple of key bottlenecks in the food trade system. For instance, when the Ever Given, that huge container ship, was stuck across the Suez Canal, had that coincided with Russia's invasion of Ukraine shutting the Turkish Straits, who knows what might have happened? It could just have brought the system down. If one of the big trading corporations, and there are 4 corporations control 90% of the global grain trade at the moment, the ABCD, Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, Cargill and Dreyfus. One of those goes down, that could be sufficient to pull the whole system down. It's far more concentrated than the financial system was. Each of those corporations is too big to fail. Or, of course, it could be an environmental crisis which tips it. It could be multiple breadbasket failure, triggered by stuck patterns in the Rossby waves in the jet stream, triggered by the whiplash effect of drought followed by flood, followed by drought, followed by flood, as opposed to the steady weather we've had before the Anthropocene. It could be any number of these tremendously powerful environmental catastrophes that we're facing at the moment. And so we have a fourth element to consider when we're talking about food systems. And one of the great dangers in these discussions, I think, is that we tend to talk about the 4 elements in isolation. So we quite rightly hear people talking about how we've got to green the agricultural system, and we urgently need to green the agricultural system. But we also need to ensure that this system continues to feed 8 billion or 9 billion or 10 billion people. We also need to ensure that we spare enough land to sustain wild ecosystems and ideally restore them on a huge scale, because frankly that's the only way we're going to prevent the 6th great extinction and draw down a significant amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Rewilding is not a nice to have, rewilding is perhaps essential for human survival. But we also at the same time have to prevent the global food system from tipping, from collapsing. And if that collapse happens, well, it might be very hard indeed to uncollapse it. And one of the frustrations I have is that You know, I'll hear someone give a wonderful presentation about their regenerative farm, and look at these wonderful things we're doing for nature on the farm. You say, hang on a moment, your yields have declined to a quarter of what they previously were. So either someone else is having to intensify to make up for that, or you're contributing to agricultural sprawl, which means using more land to produce a given amount of food. Alternatively, you'll see a presentation by someone saying, we're now producing 10 tons of wheat per hectare. And you say, that's fantastic. Congratulations, that contributes to feeding the world, but unfortunately, you're destroying your soil, you've wiped out all the insects, and you're poisoning your river. So we somehow have to bear all of these four factors in mind at the same time. And that's often very hard to do, particularly in academia, and for that matter in journalism, where we all get siloed, we get compartmentalized. Now, there are things we can do. We need to pursue a system which is simultaneously diversified, which breaks the power of corporations, at the same time maintains high yields but reduces impacts. These are very difficult things to do, but it's not impossible. So, for example, switching away from an animal-based diet to a plant-based diet takes massive pressure off both the environmental systems, earth systems, and of the food production system itself, because there needs to be far less throughput in order to ensure that everyone gets fed an adequate and healthy diet. A plant-based diet at the individual level, but also on the global level, is one of the most effective environmental changes that can be made. We can investigate further the potential of switching towards perennial grain crops and other arable crops. Enormous potential to reduce the impacts of food production by switching away from this annual trashing of the ecosystem to a trashing of the ecosystem which might only have to happen every 5 or 10 years, with far less establishment costs in terms of irrigation, pesticides, herbicides, etc., ploughing and all the rest of it. We could look also at means of producing food outside of the farming system, such as through precision fermentation, which can have far, far lower impacts per unit of food production. Now, whether all of these things could amount to a tipping point, in other words, where hysteresis is involved, well, that's questionable, but they can certainly amount to some form of system change. And system change is not a luxury. It's not something which would be nice to do, because if we don't change the system is going to change us. And it will change us in ways which aren't very nice. Thank you.
Well, that was great. Thank you all for your amazing contributions. And I really like how the kind of layering from really community level to value chain to politics to really the bigger system picture comes together. At the same time, this panel was called Positive Tipping Points in the, well, whatever it was called, in the nature of yeah, but either way, the positive part is the thing I was centering on. And I have to say that I'm not really feeling less depressed after having heard this panel than the pretty devastating sessions that I've been listening to for the past few days. So we're going to, as with all the previous sessions, get plenty of audience Q&A time. But before that, I wanted to just give us a little bit of space to reflect on, well, give you all some space to reflect on what you've heard. And I wanted to start by asking you all the same question, and feel free to bounce off one of each other and reflect on what you've all heard. What is your level of hope at this moment? Do you feel like we are, in your work, are you feeling like you're actually getting to a meaningful tipping point to shift things into the right direction? And alongside that, do you see any potential in leveling across these scales in a more meaningful way to see like, okay, well, how do we connect that community level work with the value chain work, with the policy work, with that broader narrative shift, maybe mental shift that we need to achieve? Anyone who feels like,
Easy question.
oh yeah? Good.
No, not at all. But just by introducing, I mean, hope is not the same as optimism. And Marshall often quotes a Jewish scholar saying, hope is the belief in the plausibility of the possible, as opposed to the necessity of the probable. And we really need to get thinking around how we get depressed by all those news and all the situation we're in. Hope is not to say everything will go fine. Hope is to insisting that it matters what we do right now. And that our sense of hope and sense of meaning in what we do increases by the more people we get on board our work. So hope is really key. And also as an obligation for those of us in this room who faces the most work on really, really dire negative consequences, to actually really get our heads around, our conversations around how might we actually approach the public in ways that they see are meaningful. So Naomi Klein had a piece recently calling End Time Fascism, and basically talking about how right-wing populists weaponizes the end of the world scenarios to tell everybody we're fucked anyway, so you might just concentrate on your own little turf. Mm-hmm. So I mean, and at so many levels a challenge. So my feeling is that as soon as we, Das Gupta, what's he called, the Great Derangement book.
Oh, no,
Amitav Ghosh, he was educating those of us reading a lot of climate science or doing a lot of climate science, to reminding us it's the most elite discourse originally. And as soon as you start bringing it into conversations with everyday people, you realize they get it. And it's very much about really getting our heads around to do this as local and national conversations where people actually feel a part of it. Ali Hochschild has been doing some great work in the US of meeting Trump voters and seeing they all have a language for actually seeing how difficult and dire it is. And it's very much about start listening to people and their hurts and their feeling of shame, and start building communities that are resilient and are able to respond, and not only just being left in the dark. So it's very much about, I think, realizing that people are not barriers to change. They are actually the potential drivers. That was even a quote from the chief economist by the Biden administration, who said that in the DC Tipping Points conference. We really need to get our heads around how we can start getting this conversation going in ways that people can actually play a little part. And we don't have to talk about climate change and catastrophe with everyday people. We can start by sharing a meal together, because what people long for is community. Mm. What people long for is meaning and making sense of a world that is losing sense. And then we can build a coalition around also those who really feel that it is a pressure on geopolitical tension and all that, and then you can get a very new set of audiences into the conversation about building a food security system that of course we're ready to eat less meat. So as soon as we see the right framing around it, and then we can see that in all kinds of different constituencies in Denmark that are very far from climate science and very far from Copenhagen, because they see a meaning of doing stuff together with their neighbors.
Mm-hmm. Can I build on that? I really agree, Runa, that I think, where I get a lot of hope as well is from people and community. And, I loved the picture of your child that you put up. I think it also touches my heart. And I think it also speaks to the moment in time that we're in. Obama used to say in a lot of his campaign speeches, progress is 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And, the only constant is this constant evolution of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. In many ways, we're in a 2 steps back moment. But I think by...
Maybe 3.
Maybe 3. But I think the power of the people and the community is really where I see progress starting to happen. And in many ways, I think maybe we could have reversed the order of this panel in a way to say, actually, globally, you're right. There are these really, significant structural, systemic barriers at the moment. But if we start to unpack them, and if we actually see where people's hearts and minds are, that's where we can engage with nature. I think also when we talk about protecting nature and restoring nature, that also can feel very abstracted from people's reality. So I think it's on us, really, to show how integrated we as people in communities and jobs and lives are with nature and our wider economies.
Mm. I'm sorry if I depressed everybody. That wasn't the intent. And I think what I tried to do is talk about, I probably spoke about the barriers more than the menu and the potential manifesto. All the interventions are there. Some of them have actually been marched quite a long way up the hill. And we have had a real, slap across the chops, if you like, over the last 2 to 3 years. It's been a very tough, we look at, some of the legislative moves. I mean, some of them have nearly made it through 2, 3 times. So that, that some of these things are moving. If you think about from a financial perspective, and okay, we're seeing quite a tilt now, the rush away from green funds, the anxiety around sustainable investments, not least if you're based in the US in terms of the legislative action. But actually, if you sit down and talk to those organisations about risk, and they start to look at the insurability of some of their deals, frankly, the returns that they won't receive after a 3-4 year period, these become not just stranded assets, then I wouldn't use the word hope, but I do think that some of the conditions are there. And I also think it's an invitation to this room and actually to the wider green movement in terms of, this is game on. We can't just go, God, this is awful, and hopefully it'll come right. So many of those conditions are there. And the question is, can we bring enough of those together in a way that should start to stimulate some action? Never said it's easy, but I do think some of those conditions are there. And I certainly think the framing around tipping points, both negative and positive, I was saying this to Tim earlier, I think it's a real opportunity to drive a pretty major reset in thinking, because it is a very, very frightening reality that doesn't just touch one part of the world, it touches the entire globe.
So I'm hopeful about some things, but where food systems are concerned, I'm pretty bloody depressed. Because if anything, the conversation is going backwards. Hey, I'm so cool, I'm saving the planet by eating this pasture-fed beef. Seriously, I see this all the time now. I mean, there's no more damaging food product than pasture-fed beef because of its enormous land footprint alongside its enormous greenhouse gas footprint. That's what's driving the destruction of the Amazon. That's where a lot of it is coming from now, but people genuinely believe that they're doing a good thing by eating it. Look, I'm eating this locally caught turbot. Isn't that wonderful? And this complete confusion between what looks nice, between the bucolic, romantic, aesthetic cottagecore that you can post up on Instagram, and what we actually need in order to intervene effectively in this massive system, this huge leviathan of a system, which is going to crush us into dust if we don't tackle it. The distance could not be greater. It actually has become greater since I started writing about this stuff. It's like public understanding is spiraling backwards, driven by this sort of, grow your own soul food and everything will be fine movement. Look at this beautiful picture of a courgette. This is absolutely not going to crack it. And unfortunately, a lot of the regenerative food and farming discussion is exactly in that same tone. That we just need to do it with love and do it with beauty on our own patch. That's going to fix it. No, you also have to be looking at how you interact with the global system, what the knock-on effects of what you are doing are going to be. And none of the decisions are easy. There is no easy path to sorting this stuff out. This whole drive for bucolic simplicity. We're going to go to simple living, or everyone should move to the countryside and grow their own food. This is a serious movement now. It's an absolute catastrophe, and it's very often enmeshed with the far right. The far right has picked this up. We are the true people of the land, as opposed to those urban immigrant trans people who are coming to take everything away from us. And if only people listen just to us and to no one else, then everything will go right. This is the way the food system, the farming system discussion is going, and it's an absolute catastrophe. We need to push back against it.
Well, there are so many different elements of lack of interscalar understanding, I think, in some of the ways that we're approaching these solutions. But at the same time, it's not like there's a single set of solutions. I think I would love to hear what you would ask of each other. Are there any things that have triggered your own sort of thoughts as you've listened to each other present? Because all of you have talked about the food system. I don't know whether you're all in agreement. You've talked a lot about regenerative food system approaches, also about increases in yield. Is there anything that you would say, having heard the panel?
Yeah, and maybe I can reflect a little bit on your presentation, George, because I think you're right that, well, you're right about a lot of things, and I think especially this concept of regenerative farming inherently needs a yield decrease. I think that is true, but it's also really problematic because our economy is based on this concept of yield as output per hectare, which completely undermines what the value of our ecosystem and our food systems afford. I also think this narrative of we need to ensure that we produce enough food and there's not enough food can also be unhelpful, because although it is true, we do currently produce enough food, it's just highly inefficient, and it's exactly because of the animal livestock issue that I think you raised. So I think we can produce enough food for a growing planet. It's just that some of these narratives are also co-opted in a way that helps us reinforce that, oh goodness, we couldn't possibly undermine our farmers' ability to maximize, to deliver that 10 tons per hectare, because ultimately we're then not going to be able to feed our children. No, we can still feed our children, and we can do it in a way that minimizes and shifts our consumption patterns. We just, as you also said, George, have to do those things in tandem. I also think there's emerging evidence around, I mean, so much of this is dependent on what crop you're producing, but that certain crops are actually not seeing a yield penalty. But the key issue is the amount of time it takes to transition to those systems. This isn't an overnight fix. You can't just switch to regenerative cereals production tomorrow. It needs time, it needs thought, and it also needs looking at the landscape level, which means not just looking at the farm. As I've said, if you've got a whole cluster of farms doing this together, you're going to see faster returns because you'll have more pollinators that provide natural pest control. All of these things are inherently complex, but they require a bit of time.
Okay, quickly, and then I actually just noticed that we do want to give the audience some time to ask questions. Do you want to say something fast, or do you want to hand over?
A question for you, George. I a huge admirer of your work and your books. It's very helpful for us around the world. But I was wanting to ask you, I guess you read, are familiar with Timothy Snyder's book, Black Earth, and how he basically allows us to appreciate the Hitler regime's the scare of you might call it today a climate crisis, the scare of not having enough food to feed the German population, and how that spawns that right-wing Nazist ideology of needing other people's area. And I've been, since reading that book or rereading that book this spring, been really preoccupied about how do we actually go about knowing what you say, and then actually allowing people to not get freaked out. So how can you, talk about the importance of balancing that kind of framing that you're putting forward in terms of a collapse, because it kind of produces a sense of protection, and we just need to amass the resources we can. How we combine that in that particular political situation we're in?
Yeah, well, I'm afraid it's exactly the same question when it comes to discussing the climate crisis or any aspect of the environmental crisis. You know, somehow we have to be real about it. We have to alert people to the scale of the danger we face, but without driving them into that defensive position where, right, okay, I'll go and get myself an AR-15 and some food supplies and become a prepper. You know, that is a danger, and it's a danger we all face all the time. And the only effective way of doing it is the sort of thing that you're doing, is by building community around resilience, building community around better solutions. But at the same time, obviously, of course, we need to be pressuring governments, because a lot of this stuff can only be resolved at the global level. You know, but obviously the danger of balkanization, of a Pujadist response to these crises is a very real one, and it keeps cropping up. I know there's at least a couple of people in the audience, Laurie, James, and others who have been working on exactly this, that how the crisis, instead of triggering solutions, can actually trigger a reactionary response, which can then lead to political crisis on top of environmental crisis. That's what we need to avoid.
Let's take a few questions at a time. So Sandrine, and then there's so many hands. Then pass back, and let's see if we have another microphone to start from the top there. And let's try to get 3 and then see how quickly we can go.
So Sandrine Dixon-DeCleve, I'm the former president of the Club of Rome, but also for my sins actually led the action track at the UN Food System Summit on resilience. And I just want to 100% hands down agree with George on this. I'm sorry. We are in the midst of a food shit show. And the politics are immense. The UN Food System Summit, 2.5 years, we had so much engagement, solutions, possibilities, hope, opportunities. And in a few weeks, it was slammed down by a negotiation that was made between Argentina, Brazil, and the US, and the UN. Yeah. And that's the reality. So within that, I did not hear about our new strategy. I really didn't, because we are naive. And we can build up the community, and it's fundamental, and we will look at bioregions. But when you think that you work on all of these solutions, bring all the right people, everything together after 2 years, and then in 1 second it's shot down, you have a problem. The last point, and I just want to ask you, George, because thank you for bringing up financial stability mechanisms. We had put forward a food stability board option, and we were told it's too complicated, it's never going to work. I still think we should put that on the table. I think it is also fundamental. The last point is, one of the things we all got wrong is that we have to get down and dirty with the farmers. We have to figure out how we're going to make the current landowners and new landowners part of the solution, because they're the ones that are bringing in the populistic governments. And final point, if I may, let me give you my version of hope, okay? People speak of hope as if it's this delicate little thing made of whispers and spiderwebs. It's not. Hope has dirt on her face, blood on her knuckles, the grit of cobblestones in her hair, and just spat out another tooth as she rises for another go. That's the version of hope that we need to bring into this fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandrine. Can you pass through that now? All right, let's try to do the questions quickly.
I'll do very
Thank you
fast.
so much.
It's a question for George, and maybe I will be a bit provocative for what you have said. So I fully agree with you with the courgette idea. A question, I've been working for the UN and for different countries where we are promoting for 2 years renewable energies in many countries. So I think it's a good thing. But in some countries it was not a case where they were ready. So don't you think that we are also having this view about renewable energies? It's some place where we use a lot of land, we use a lot of material. That could be a bit analogy with your idea of the courgette, where some countries, you say, look, it's very, very good idea to go to renewable energy when they are not ready, or maybe is bringing something a bit more complicated for the future. So I wanted to know a bit your position on this one. Thank you.
Can you please pass to Carlos down here, and then can you go ahead and ask your question?
Can you hear me? Great. So Taco Bosman with EY. So getting down and dirty with the smallholder farmers in the coffee sector, which you cited, it's a key sector. Behind oil and gas, it's the next most traded commodity in the world. My thoughts go to the hundreds of thousands of smallholder farmers and the pickle that they're in, stuck between physical tipping points and droughts, and the necessary tipping points towards regenerative farming. What tips do you have to the coffee majors and how they're interacting with the smallholder farmers, considering the smallholder farmers can also switch crops and aren't tied to any one particular coffee major?
Thank you, Carlos, and then we'll do a round, and then we'll go back.
Yes, I just want to tell you something that I learned in the Amazon, talking to many indigenous people. Of course, as you know, indigenous people are there for 14,000 years. They never led any species to extinction. They used more than 2,300 species. And then it's very interesting, you know, even some fish that they know exactly how to fish, not to let, one is called pirarucu, et cetera, et cetera. So I always ask them, you know, they told me it's not even a social, cultural, it's a religious tipping point. They say when their gods tell them not to lead to extinction. That's very interesting thing about the indigenous people.
All right, thank you, everyone. All right, so a lightning round, and then we'll go back to the audience. What do you feel inspired by? What is our strategy? How to engage with smallholder farmers? Let's do a quick.
So the food system is one for every one of us, and we tend to silo it. So in Denmark, the main reason why the tripartite agreement was so strong was that the metal workers union were in the room negotiating. They were the fiercest fighter for the agreement, because they knew that it was industry and manufacturing that would face the consequences if agriculture was not put on the table. So really being smart about the coalitions we can build to make sure that it's industry pushing agribusiness, because agriculture, even in Denmark, it's very poor margins, it doesn't contribute to our GDP, and it just fucks our oceans. So, and that's the kind of argument that just gets the ball rolling, especially with that was very quick.
Thank you. George, I think a bunch of the questions were to you, so.
Yeah, I love the idea of the Food Stability Board. I'd love to hear a lot more about that. That's exactly what we need, exactly the sort of global initiative which is essential. I'd be careful about talking about hope like that, because this government's going to lock you up as a terrorist.
Pretty close to being locked up.
Yeah, but you're so right. Right. I mean, the way you put it is absolutely right. That's exactly what we need. And of course, inherent in that, is this idea, we have to be political, and being political in between elections means protesting above everything else, because that's our most powerful political tool. And if we don't use it, we lose it.
Any other quick thoughts?
I have two quick thoughts. One, Sandrine, I've been a big supporter. I was nodding vociferously, big supporter of the Food System Stability Board. After 2008, 2009, we set up someone set up the Financial Stability Board as a means of saying, oh God, we can't let this happen again. Why can't we do the same thing for food systems, given we all need to eat 3 or more times a day? On the question about coffee, I think there are two things. One thing that really strikes me is that the world's coffee production is fundamentally based on Arabica and Robusta coffee. We talk about commodities because we have focused on completely minimize the diversity of species, of different types of products, but actually there are so many different types of coffee that are out there, and there's great work being done by Kew Botanical Gardens and others trying to explore and actually build the value chains for those other types of coffee that are already being produced by many organizations, but just haven't, or by many farmers, but just haven't gotten to scale because the value chains, the buyers aren't there. So that's my encouragement, is let's explore more than just Arabica and Robusta.
Any last thoughts?
2 last things. Sandrine, I know we work very closely with you on the Food Summit, and we're vastly frustrated by those vested interests, which are shocking, and I think it's important that people know and understand the nature of those vested interests. Food is a sovereign issue. I mean, sit down with a colleague from India, sit down with a colleague from the UK. So the question is, how do we land this in a way that's not threatening to that sovereignty, which we will see more and more of in the weeks, the months, and indeed the years to come? And I guess just the final comment on farmers. I think it's very easy for environmentalists to vilify farmers. We do eat the food they produce. I do think that farmers and farming communities can be an incredible part of the solution. And the question is, how do we do that in a more thoughtful way that actually both supports and incentivises, but of course at moments absolutely challenges some of those approaches to date.
All right, we are going to take 2 more questions. It's going to be really difficult, but maybe from up there. Okay, there's someone waving their hand up there at the top. Oh, yeah, it's very far from the microphone. I'm sorry. And then someone on this side. Okay, I don't. That person. Well, okay, go ahead, and 2 fast questions, please, and then we'll do a wrap-up round and some final comments.
Thanks very much. I love to eat, so I love this panel. I'm Courtney Howard. I'm a doctor from Canada. I'm the chair of the Global Climate and Health Alliance, and I'm standing up because I own part of the family farm in Canada. It's been in the family. We're settlers for about 140 years, and all of my grandma's generation was about this tall. And so despite living on a farm, they were essentially malnourished because there were 9 or 10 kids in each generation. And then we came up with the birth control pill. And my entire like all the women in my family are my height or taller. So there's evidence that if we increase access to sexual and reproductive health care for women, if we make sure that women have access to education, yields go up for women smallholder farmers. We know we end up with smaller, more well-educated generations. And in fact, if you have a woman who can read trying to help her children escape a flood, mortality goes down as well from disasters. And so I'm wondering, I just looked through the program, I haven't seen anything around access to education or sexual and reproductive health care, and I think there's a really strong intersection with farming. We'll decrease the number of people we have to feed, people live better, mortality goes up, or goes down for both women and babies. So I'm wondering if there's a social tipping point we're missing, and I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, my name is Kai. I'm a first-year PhD student here, and thank you for all your work and this great discussion. This is sort of picking up on the conversation about like dirty and rough hope and activism. But George, you talk about scientists being behind a plate of glass and the need to protect, protest, and get involved. Like, how can we as scientists in this room be doing that? We're hearing like terrifying conversations and we're still sitting in this room. So like, what can we do as a research practitioner community to like meaningfully break that glass and engage in this in a meaningful way?
Thank you both. And so sorry to everyone who wants to ask questions. I know this is a very interesting group to talk to. We have 2 minutes officially, so I would love to ask each of you to just do a 30-second closeout, reflecting either on one of these questions or on something else that you would like to leave the audience with, considering what we've heard so far. Why don't we start with you and go down?
So just a narrow part of what you were asking in terms of what can you do as scientists. I really love, what I love about the Positive Tipping Points framework is the interdisciplinary work, and we really need to be educating social sciences about how they can use climate science to integrate, but it's maybe especially the other way around as well, basically to engage more with the social sciences in order to understand how can we actually start working to scale and appreciate spreading all this. So we need much more of that, and also funding for much more of that kind of work, where we basically be much more smart about how we can understand the social dynamics behind positive tipping points and democratic renewal.
Wow, this has been such a rich panel. I don't know how to summarize it, but if I can just also reflect on the comment about sort of education and human and reproductive health, I think, you know, what all of everything we've been talking about today is beyond food and nature specifically. This is about the societies and the environment we live in. So I think these are really important topics, and I think when we focus on the positive tipping points, we absolutely need to think, widen our toolkit to make sure that we are being as holistic as we can to ensure that maybe we don't have to use the same words if they're terrifying or if they instill fear in certain communities. So making sure we're being aware about the narratives that are important to the people we're engaging with, so that we can use the toolkit we have to drive these positive tipping points.
With time in mind, I'll make just one comment, and it's on the sexual and reproductive health. I have yet to meet a woman anywhere in the world, and I've been privileged to travel to many places, who's had 8, 9, 10, even 12 children, who said, you know what, I wish I'd had one more child. Never. Please educate the girl child, ensure that women have the choice to be economically productive or support their communities. It's a central factor.
In response to Kai's question, look, this is not your failure. This is not the fault of scientists. You guys are doing great work. It's the failure of my industry above everything else. You know, the media has comprehensively failed us on these questions. It has confused people, it has misinformed people, it has denied, delayed, prevented effective change. All effective change is an ecosystem, right? We need people specializing, doing their own special thing as well as they possibly can. And that might be the science. It might be the journalism. Unfortunately, there are precious few people doing it well in my industry. It might be being a brilliant administrator, being a brilliant accountant for a climate campaign, being a fantastic therapist, whatever it might be. We need people using those specialist skills, deploying them to address these huge existential crises that we face. So don't try to be something other than you are. Carry on doing the great work that you're doing, but push other people to do better in their fields as well.
All right. So it has been a real privilege to be here with such a wonderful panel. And I hope that those of you in the audience have caught some glimmers of hope amidst the kind of bottom layer of despair. I do think that there are pathways that at least I can pick out, kind of like constellations, through the different solutionscapes that we've witnessed here. And I wish we could stay here for another hour to continue hashing this out. But I hope that there's an opportunity to do that over dinner or drinks. And there is another series of very inspiring sessions. So thank you all for your attention and for being here with us.
Yeah, thanks to our wonderful panel for this great discussion. Thanks to all of you for engaging in this discussion as well. And let me just briefly remind you, so it doesn't stop here. We have another set of fantastic breakout sessions coming up. But then also after that, we have another session tonight at 8 o'clock about the role of science and scientists, and also including the co-creation of new policies. So make sure to come back for that here to the auditorium. And then it was announced earlier as well, there's also a disco coming up tonight, and I do believe we have a slide on that as well. Oh, I just got this, okay. Well, there you go. From 7 p.m. on the piazza. Okay. All right, thank you.